I shall only further add that our author, in his invectives against the act he mentions so often, tells us on page 21 that it looks very like a restricting of ministerial freedom that he frequently harps upon. As also that it is more a term of ministerial communion than an act of assembly, 1733, and he reckons it a very sinful term of communion, pages 181 and 182. To which I answer, that as all the proceedings of that assembly were for the support and advancement of our Reformation, so there is no freedom restricted, but such as may be justly reckoned a freedom of writing and speaking against our confession of faith and our Reformation principles. And our author has given too many evidences of his favoring a sinful latitudinarian freedom in his lax principles concerning church communion that run through his essay. With respect to our author's arguing that it is a very sinful term of ministerial communion, or at least that, according to the Brethren's reasonings upon the Act 1733, it may be reckoned a term of ministerial communion, though in our author's account a very sinful one. I answer that when I consider the faithful actings and proceedings of the Assembly 1638, as I look upon the act that he quarrels to be still a binding act, so I judge that our author, or any others who treat the proceedings of that assembly in the manner that he has done, deserve the censures of the Church, and if the discipline of the Lord's house were rightly exercised, the spiritual sword would be drawn against them. But it is to be regretted that matters are otherwise stated amongst us, and that such as testify against a course of defection will sooner fall under the censures of the present judicatories than those who extenuate or palliate the same. Section 3. Wherein the exceptions are laid by the author of the essay against the acts and proceedings of several assemblies of our reforming period after the year 1738 are considered. The author of the essay gathers together a great heap of matter from the beginning of the 4th section of his 6th chapter, page 79, to his 7th chapter, page 214, that is, for about 132 pages. It is laid in such a confused manner and is never distinguished under the proper heads or sections that it is very difficult to trace him. The same things are repeated frequently over and over again. I shall not concern myself in his arguings against the author of the book called Plain Reasonings, but shall only meddle with such things as have a direct relation to the testimony of the seceding brethren. I have had occasion upon the former heads to examine a great many of the particulars advanced by our author in his long section against the said brethren. But in regard that our author musters up many acts and proceedings of our reforming assemblies, which he reckons faults and failings, or bad acts in what he calls that extolled period, yea, likewise, according to his ordinary way, with an if, with a perhaps, endeavors to impress his readers with the proceedings for 12 years' time from 1638 to 1650, were more tyrannical than any other proceedings of the judicatories of this church since the Revolution, and therefore he condemns the seceding ministers because they do not in their testimony, condemn the faults and failings of this church before the year 1650, as well as her defections after that time. This obliges me to consider the bad acts that he has charged upon the assemblies of the above-mentioned period, and, in regard, I have swelled this book too much already. I shall only take notice of such of them as our author seems to lay most weight and stress upon. Our author, on page 88, takes notice of a complaint, which he calls a great clamour made against the Church of Scotland as being Erastian, quote, because sometimes, as in 1692, when the day was altered for the Assembly's meeting, the Assembly submitted and yet gave no testimony against this encroachment, unquote. The case stands thus. The General Assembly in the year 1692 was dissolved by the King's Commissioner. The moderator protested against the dissolution of that assembly, and they immediately rose. After the next day was named by the moderator for the meeting of the next assembly. But by the King's proclamation from the Cross of Edinburgh, their meeting was adjourned from time to time till March of 1694. And if our author will believe Mr. Hogg in his life, as well as many others, they report that a considerable body of the ministry made an apology to the king for the moderator's taking upon him to name the day of the meeting of another assembly, after his majesty by his commissioner had dissolved them, as also that the diet named by the moderator was deserted, which last cannot be refused. Therefore, many did justly complain that the Church of Scotland had submitted unto an Erastian encroachment, and that she had thereby departed from a material branch and part of her testimony, especially when the Assembly 1690 had never asserted the just rights and privileges of the courts of the King of Zion. And when the Assembly did meet 1694, they gave no manner of testimony against the above dissolution, neither did they assert the just rights and privileges of the kingdom of Christ, though the above encroachment upon the same was reckoned by many a particular and special call to this necessary duty. Our author tells us, he frankly owns, that, quote, it was the fault of the civil government and a fault of his Majesty King William, that he by his proclamation did alter the time appointed for the meeting of our General Assembly, and that it was the King's fault that by his commissioner in 1692 he raised that Assembly, and also he thinks it was the sin of the Church of Scotland that she did not adhere to the protest, taken by Mr. Crichton, her moderator at that Assembly, unquote. But to extenuate what he humbly thinks to be a sin, he tells us, quote, that the Church of Scotland was thus guilty in what they reckon her best times. For, says he, though the Assembly 1638 appointed their next meeting to be upon the 3rd Wednesday of July, 1639, appointed such as should not acquiesce to their acts to be cited to that time. Yet the king altered the day, and they did not meet until the 17th of August that year, and we read of no testimony that was given by the Church of Scotland against what was done in that affair, unquote. All this is told by our author, not only with the design to extenuate the sin of the Church of Scotland, but likewise with the design to fix a charge upon our reforming period of departing from the testimony they had given for the rights of Christ's spiritual kingdom. But if our author has dealt in a fair and candid manner with the Assembly 1639, he ought likewise to have told his reader how it came to pass the day appointed by the Assembly 1638 was not kept, and therefore I think it not amiss to give the reader as short an account of it as I can. The apologetic relation gives a short hint at it, but the Latin historian gives the fullest historical account of the transactions of the year 1639 that I have seen, and the reader may take from him the following short relation of this matter. The several commissioners of the General Assembly, 1638, having faithfully discharged their duty in purging the house of God of many corrupt ministers, in consequence of the power and instructions that were given unto them by the said Assembly, such as they had duly censured, together with the deposed and excommunicate bishops, being filled with rage, did run to the court and stirred up the king to make war against Scotland. And accordingly war is concluded both by sea and land against this kingdom. And preparations are made for coming down in a hostile manner, in order, as was given out, to reduce the rebels in Scotland to the king's obedience. In the meantime, a declaration is given by the estates of this nation for their own necessary vindication, wherein they justify their bygone proceeding, and prove that the security of their civil liberties and religion was their only intention and design, and conscience was their only motive in all that they had done. But this declaration was suppressed by the court in England, and the true state of affairs in Scotland might not be known. And by the king's orders, there is a contrary declaration emitted, stilling the Covenanters seditious rebels. This was read in all the churches in England to inflame that nation against them. When the estates of Scotland saw that they could expect nothing but war, they resolved to prepare for their just and necessary defense. They levied an army of 24,000 men, who marched to the borders under the command of General Leslie. The principal nobility and barons of the kingdom were in the army, and many of the ministry. They resolved to keep themselves upon the defensive, and not to remove out of the Scots side, and in the whole of their behavior to testify to the English that they had no design either of the rebellion against the king or of war against the English nation, though they had been loaded with such unjust calumnies and aspirations. This was indeed a rare and singular army, as the Latin historian reports. When they encamped at Dunstlaw on the border, there was, quote, a wonderful unanimity amongst the leaders and foldiers, with a cheerful resolution for the support and defense of their common cause. They were frequent in the exercise of public and private religion, and there was nothing of that wickedness or intemperance to be seen amongst them which is so frequent in military camps. Their hours were divided throughout the whole army into prayers, preachings, and necessary refreshments of their bodies, and the exercise of their arms, unquote. Mr. Livingston, in his life, reports that when he went up with the army to England, 1640, quote, it was very refreshful to remark that after they came to a quarter at night, there was nothing to be heard almost through the whole army but singing of psalms, prayer, and reading of the Scriptures by the soldiers in their several tents. He adds, and, as it was informed, there was largely more the year before, when the army lay at Dunslaw, unquote. When the English army beheld the disposition and behavior of the Scots army, they were satisfied that they had been imposed upon, and therefore some of the English nobility proposed unto the Scots that they should petition the king for a treaty, which they did accordingly. Upon which a treaty ensued, and, amongst other things, in the treaty it was agreed that a free national assembly should be held at Edinburgh upon the 6th of August, and that the Parliament should meet at the same place upon the 20th of August, in order to give the civil sanction to the acts and proceedings of the assembly. Our author is then in a mistake when he affirms that the king altered the day to the 17th of August. If he had observed the printed Acts of Assembly, 1639, he might have seen that the first printed act, bearing date August 17, was passed in the 8th session of that assembly. Besides, from the short historical account I have given, the reader may see the vast disparity that there is betwixt what passed in the year 1692 and the year 1639, as, for instance, the Assembly 1692, when it was met, was dissolved by the king's authority, and they did immediately rise in obedience thereunto, but the Assembly 1639 was neither convened nor dissolved. Again, the king, by his sole authority, altered the day that was named by the moderator of the Assembly 1692, and adjourned the meeting of the next assembly from time to time till the year 1694. But the diet appointed for the Assembly 1639 was altered by a treaty concluded betwixt the king and the flower of the nation, with the consent of a considerable body of the ministry, who were there present by the appointment of their presbyteries. Likewise, the diet of the Assembly in the year 1692 was adjourned by the king's proclamation for about the space of 2 years. But by the treaty at Dunslaw, the meeting of the assembly was only adjourned for about 20 days at most. And when it was considered that the camp at Dunslaw did break up only on the 20th of June, where such a considerable part of the nation were present, it cannot be well presumed that in the present situation of their affairs they could be in readiness to meet together in a national assembly at the time appointed in the month of July. From all which it may be very evident how unjust our author is in charging the Assembly 1639 with neglecting a testimony against the 20 days adjournment of the meeting of the Assembly, and how little it supports his charge against the Assembly 1639, that is, that they were guilty of what is justly complained of with respect to the management of this church in the year 1692. I shall now consider the exceptions that our author lays against our reforming period on account of their imposing of the covenants under severe penalties, as he alleges. But before he enters upon this head, he makes a profession of our owning, page 109, quote, that it was a praise and glory to our land to be a people solemnly devoted to the Lord, sworn to be for him and to live to his praise. He likewise owns, this land hath been heinously guilty many ways, both in former and later times, in breaking our national engagements. This, says he, is just ground of lamentation, unquote. But then our author is very sparing in his condescending upon particular instances. He indeed tells us some have violated our covenants by turning to popery, and others by disloyalty to our rightful sovereigns. These are his particulars. But then, when he tells us that some have violate them by turning to other dreadful errors, and by sinful complying with and declaring for prelacy, and some by schism and sinful division, his reader is left to make his conjectures what these dreadful errors or sinful divisions are, and what these compliances or declarations for prelacy were, or who were the compilers with or declarers for prelacy. Our author likewise, on page 112, would have his readers believe that he is not speaking against the covenants themselves, but against the manner of imposing them. As the manner of imposing them, he tells us on page 111, quote, that if the covenants were to be renewed, it would be a sin to enjoin them under any such severe penalties as the church and state enforced them with from 1638 to 1649. And, says he, if we are to give a full, free, faithful testimony against the sins of our forefathers, as well as against the sins of our own day, instancing their iniquities as causes of fasting, then I think we ought to acknowledge the sin of church and state in that period in imposing these solemn covenants under such severe penalties, which were a strong temptation to the dreadful sin of perjury, unquote.